a lot of people see migration as a problem, or talks about the problems of migration, which in my humble opinion is totally wrong. Migration is not a problem. Migration is a fact of life, and it's true that there are challenges to managing migration, but it's not a problem per se. What we try to do from a very legal perspective, when we want to make certain that rights of migrants are protected, is that we try to focus on the fact that having a human rights-based approach to migration and having a human rights-based approach to migration management really is the only sustainable way forward. Let me give a few examples. If you have a huge segment of the population in your workforce which is composed of irregular migrants, there's a very good chance, well, it's not a good chance, but there's a very big chance that these people will be working in an exploitative environment, which obviously is very bad for the individual. That's a protection angle. It's also not very good for the state, because there will be a segment of the population and a segment of the labor market which is then not controlled. So it is a win-win situation for the state to actually have effective labor legislation protecting these migrants, which I think we can realize there will very often be migrants working in these irregular situations because they are easier targets. You can see this quite clearly both from a human rights perspective. If you look, for instance, to the advisory opinion of the Inter-American Court, stating very clearly that any irregular migrant, the moment he or she is in a work situation, has derivative labor rights. You are a worker before you are an irregular migrant. You can see it at the EU level, that in a directive from the EU targeting the employment of what the EU terms illegal migrants, illegal third country nationals. I'll come back to why we don't like that. One of the sanctions to employers is to pay back minimum wages, for instance. And you can see that's a sanction against the employer, and this is very much targeting avoiding having illegal third country nationals in the EU, but at the same time it's a protection of the individual. So there are two sides to this coin, and both sides will, if implemented and if understood in the right way, actually further protection. Another point that I would like to make is that from a legal perspective, terminology is so terribly important, and that's also something that we try to further when we talk to our counterparties in states or in governments particularly. First of all, we vehemently oppose the use of the term illegal migrants. A person can never be illegal. You can be in an illegal situation, you can have entered a country illegally, but you as a person can never be illegal. You can be irregular. Another thing that I think is important, I think Jens mentioned before, that some of us might be migrants and not even think about ourselves as that. It's also important to notice that it's just an anecdote, but I have colleagues who think that they are migrants and legally they are not. We are international civil servants. We are not migrant workers, mainly, I guess, because we don't work that much, but apart from that. Let me give you an example, which is rather egocentrical, which is because it's about me. I have a Danish passport. And as Jens said, I worked for a long time in Italy, also not as an international civil servant. And now I am an international civil servant, so not a migrant worker. But I actually moved to Italy when the European mobility was already rather well established. So also there I was not considered a migrant worker. So terminology is important. And so are the words such as should or could or shall. I think it's important when we talk about social rights and economic rights to know that migrants should not have rights. Migrants have rights. Both established on the Migrant Workers Convention that I'm sure that Jacob will talk more about, a convention we know suffer from the lack of ratification, but also according to major covenants and other international human rights instruments. There's absolutely no doubt about the fact that also irregular migrant workers, for instance, have basic rights. It's true that certain economic rights, such as the right to social security, can be limited to nationals, but the right not to emergency but to basic healthcare, which is totally different. Emergency healthcare is often much more costly, and it's also the last resort, whereas basic healthcare is something that you offer to also including preventive healthcare, for instance, is something that migrants have. I'm not here saying that the world is rosy and that implementation is perfect. If it was, I would be out of a job. I would focus on tax law and make a lot more money. But legally speaking, these rights are in place. Another thing that I think we need to focus on, or just to remember, just to recall, which refers to terminology, is that when we talk about gender, we don't always only talk about women. Gender is men and women. And I think it's absolutely true that, as several panelists here have underlined, that women are clearly more at risk of being exploited in many situations. But just to give you one example, for a very long time, when we talked about trafficking and the rights of victims of trafficking and the protection of victims of trafficking, we focused a lot on women trafficked for sexual exploitation, particularly. And that actually had a rather serious harmful effect on men who were trafficked for labor exploitation, for instance, into the agricultural sector. So it's very important that we don't forget that gender is actually both. Within what we do in the advocacy on the advocacy aspects, what we try always to underline is that migration management is not only about having effective border management. It's not only about having control of exit and entry. It's about having all those things, but with respect for the individual's rights. I have been accused of being hardcore protection or a human rights Taliban a few times, which are labels I wear with a certain pride. And usually people are rather surprised when I say that border control is actually a good thing. Border control is a good thing as long as border control does not become limiting access for everybody and anything that comes in. It's at the borders that we might actually discover a lot of trafficking, smuggling, which in turn will help the victims. But what's very important is that such management, that part of migration management, has a very clear human rights component to it and has a very clear focus on the individual's rights. But apart from that, migration management is also other things. It's also having reasonable policies on migration. And having reasonable policies on migration does not mean that we block the entry for the workforce that we actually need. We can see that a number of countries have a huge irregular migration or migrant workforce in their countries. And why is that migration workforce or migrant workforce there? Because there's a need for it, which means that those countries most probably do not have a reasonable migration policy. It's not easy, and here I'm coming back to Jens's question, I think, more or less, to convince states that they should manage migration and have migration policies that are a little bit more long-term, because there is a general political discourse that right now we manage migration. Migration is a crisis issue right now. It's a hot topic because if we're not in an election campaign, we might be in a few years. But from the work that I see that we do in the International Migration Law Unit, when we go out and talk to governments, there is most certainly a willingness to listen to incorporating not only human rights, but generally an international legal basis for their laws and for their policies. Because it's also important to notice that when we talk about the international legal framework governing migration, it's not only human rights, it's also transnational criminal law, it's labor law, international labor law, it's in certain instances even international humanitarian law, international criminal law, it's the law of the sea. So there are a number of international standards that are in place, and within this framework, states ought to implement their migration policies. And I think it is pretty clear that they will have a more sustainable migration policy if they obey by the rules that they themselves have actually created and signed up for.